There is a fire lookout tower on the eastern slope of Roan Mountain that has been staffed every season for over 90 years. I know this because I spent 4 months living in it. I know it because I signed a contract, learned the radio protocols, learned the weather codes, and showed up on the 1st of May with 2 duffel bags and a box of groceries. I know it because I never once looked down from that tower at night, not after the 3rd week, not after I understood what was down there looking up. I have not been back since September. I have not spoken about it until now. I still can't look anyone directly in the eyes for more than a few seconds. My therapist says it will pass. I don't think it will pass. You're welcome to comment your city and the time below. I always enjoy reading them. If you find these stories interesting, please consider subscribing. My name is not important. What's important is that 18 months ago I was a project coordinator for a mid-sized environmental consulting firm in Asheville, and then I wasn't. Layoffs, they called it. Company restructuring. They gave me a box, a handshake, and 2-week severance for 3 years of work. My girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, by the time I'm telling you this, did not handle the uncertainty well. Neither did I. We handled it in different directions, loudly, for about 6 weeks, and then she took the cat and went to stay with her sister in Charlotte and never came back for her things. I still have 2 boxes of her stuff in my closet. I haven't opened them. That detail will matter later, and not in the way you're thinking right now. The apartment was expensive. My savings were not extensive. I sent out resumes for 11 weeks and got 3 phone screens and 0 callbacks. I applied to coffee shops. I applied to a hardware store. I drove for a rideshare company 3 nights a week and made enough to cover my phone bill and half my groceries. The fire lookout position was posted on a state forestry jobs board that I stumbled onto at 2 in the morning during what I can only describe as a very thorough spiral. The listing said it paid $18 an hour plus free housing, which was the tower itself, plus a small monthly stipend for food. It said the position ran May through September. It said the nearest town was 40 minutes away by Forest Road. It said the successful candidate would be comfortable with extended solitude. I read that last part as a qualification. I had not considered it might also be a warning. I applied the same night. I heard back in 2 days. The woman who called me, whose name was Karen Solis and who worked in the regional forestry office in Burnsville, sounded genuinely pleased that I'd applied. Almost relieved, she sounded. I noticed that and filed it under good sign instead of where it actually belonged. She told me the position had been difficult to fill in recent years. I asked why. She said the isolation was hard for most people. I said isolation sounded fine to me, and I meant it because at that point my apartment felt like a waiting room for a life that had already left without me. She sent the contract the next day. I signed it. I drove up to the mountain on a Sunday in late April to see the tower before I committed to moving in. The forest road up was steep and full of switchbacks, and there were places where the tree canopy closed over the road so completely that it felt like driving through a tunnel. The tower itself was a good structure. Metal stairs, a small glass cab at the top with windows on all 4 sides, and underneath it, where the support legs met the platform, a small wooden cabin that had been added sometime in the 50s. 1 room, with stove, cot, a hand pump that pulled water up from a cistern buried under the platform. No cell service but a radio and a satellite internet connection for weather reports. I stood up in the cab with Karen and looked out over 30 miles of mountain ridgeline in every direction, and I felt, for the first time in months, like maybe things could be all right. She walked me through the duties, scanned the horizon for smoke columns twice hourly during the day, log weather readings every 3 hours, radio conditions into the district office at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., maintain the access road monthly, keep the equipment log current. Standard stuff. Then she handed me a laminated card. She said it was the operational addendum. She said all the remote stations had one. She said it was supplementary to the main contract and that it contained some specific protocols for this particular post. I looked at the card. It listed 7 rules. I read them and I laughed a little, because some of them seemed absurd. She did not laugh back. She said, and I can still hear her voice when I remember this, very flat and very careful. She said, "These aren't suggestions. They're part of the position. If you can't commit to all 7, we'd rather know now." I committed to all 7. I took the job. I drove home and packed my bags. I did not ask her who had written the rules, or why they existed, or what had happened to make them necessary. That question would come later. The answer would cost more than I was prepared to pay. The 7 rules on the laminated card were as follows. 1. Do not go below the platform level between the hours of 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. 2. Do not respond to any sound that resembles a human voice coming from below the tree line at night. Do not call back. Do not investigate. 3. If you see a light moving in the forest between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. that does not belong to a vehicle on the access road, log it and radio it in. Do not attempt to locate its source. 4. The water in the cistern is safe. Do not collect water from any other source, regardless of taste, clarity, or convenience. 5. If at any point you notice an entry in the equipment log that you do not remember making, radio it in immediately. Do not attempt to interpret it yourself. 6. If something or someone calls your name from below the tree line, do not answer, even if the voice is familiar to you, especially if the voice is familiar to you. 7. Whatever you may find in the tower that predates your arrival is not yours to remove. Leave it exactly where you find it. You may read it. You may not take it. I read those 7 rules 4 or 5 times in my apartment before I moved in. And I did what I think most people do when they encounter something they'd rather not take seriously. I started explaining them away. Rule 1 and 2, liability language, I figured. Some previous employee had walked in the dark and fallen, or startled wildlife, and the Forestry Service had overreacted with overly cautious paperwork. Rule 3, probably about illegal hunting, I decided. Poachers used lights. You weren't supposed to confront poachers. Rule 4, probably about a contamination incident with a nearby stream. Standard water safety protocol. Rule 5, probably about data integrity. Making sure I didn't accidentally attribute someone else's log entries to myself. Rule 6 was harder. Rule 6 was the one that sat in my chest a little sideways, even before I knew why. I told myself it was about bears, about the way some animals can produce sounds that resemble human voices. I'd read about that somewhere. I packed my bags. I moved in on the 1st of May. The first few weeks were fine, better than fine. I woke up before sunrise and made coffee on the wood stove and climbed the stairs to the cab and watched the mountains go pink and gold while I logged my first weather reading of the day. I read books. I took long walks down the access road in the afternoon. I started sleeping 9 hours a night, which I had not done in years. And then, quietly, things started to be a little wrong. The first thing, the birds. The forest around Roan Mountain was loud with birds. All of May, the way you'd expect. Thrushes and warblers and the occasional raven. And then in the second week of June they just quieted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but by the third week of June, the forest below the tower was noticeably quieter in the mornings than it had been in May. I told myself nesting season was changing their behavior. I'm not a biologist. It was probably fine. The second thing, the smell. There was a smell sometimes in the early evening that came up from the hollow on the north side of the mountain. I can only describe it as something between rain on hot pavement and turned earth, but sweeter than both. Not unpleasant exactly, just out of place. I couldn't find a source. I logged it twice as an anomalous atmospheric condition and told myself it was some combination of plant matter and temperature inversion. The third thing, the fog. Mountain fog is normal. I knew that going in. But the fog in that particular hollow to the north behaved strangely. It moved in the wrong direction sometimes, against the wind, which should not be possible. I watched it twice in June, in the early morning, rolling slowly uphill against a clear downslope breeze, gathering against the tree line at the base of the tower instead of dispersing. I don't have a logical explanation for that. I gave it one anyway. The fourth thing, the well. I started smelling something mineral and cold when I used the hand pump. Clean, but there was something underneath the clean. Something that reminded me of old pennies. I had the water tested by bringing a sample down to the county health office on my first day off. Came back perfectly fine. Still, I bought bottled water on the same trip and used the pump only for washing after that. Rule 4 was about the water being safe. I believed the test. I didn't stop feeling like something was wrong with it. The fifth thing was the door. Every morning when I woke up, the cabin door was unlocked. I was certain I locked it every night. I used a deadbolt. I checked it before I climbed into the cot. Every single night. I started checking it twice. Still unlocked in the mornings. I took the lock apart, found nothing wrong with it, reassembled it, same thing. I told myself I was forgetting. I told myself I was stressed or sleepwalking or something. I told myself a lot of things in those early weeks. What I should have done was radio it in. I didn't, because I was stubborn, and because radioing in an unlocked door felt embarrassing, and because I had not yet understood that the rules were written by people who had already learned the cost of taking things lightly. The first real thing happened on a Thursday in late June. I was up in the cab after 10, which was fine. The rule was about going below platform level. I was logging the last weather reading before bed, and I heard a sound from the forest to the north. It was a voice. I can't tell you what it said. I genuinely don't remember the words, only that it was a human voice, male, and that it sounded like someone in moderate pain. Like someone who had fallen and was calling for help but trying to stay calm about it. I stood very still. Rule 2 was in my head immediately. Do not respond. Do not investigate. But this was a voice. Person's voice. Sounded real. Sounded like pain. I stood at the cab window for 4 minutes. I watched the clock, while the voice came again twice more. The second time, it sounded closer. The third time, it sounded like it was just inside the tree line below the platform. I did not go down. I don't know why exactly. Some animal part of my brain that was faster than my conscience. I gripped the edge of the console and I stayed where I was and I did not go down. The voice did not come again after the third time. The forest went quiet. Not normal quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like something is holding its breath. I radioed it in at 6 the next morning. The forestry office sent 2 rangers to walk the area. They found nothing. No sign of any person. No disturbance in the undergrowth. No trail marks. The ranger who came up to give me the all clear, a young woman named Dara, who had dark red hair and the easy confidence of someone who spent all her time in forests and was simply not afraid of them. She told me they got about 2 calls a season like this from fire station observers. Sound carried strangely in these hollows, she said. Animals, echoes, sometimes the wind itself through certain formations of rock and wood. She said it casually, the way you say something true that you also know doesn't account for everything. And then she said something that surprised me. She said, "You stayed up top?" I said yes. She said, "Good. Just that. Good." And then she climbed back down the stairs and drove her truck back down the access road, and I watched her taillights disappear into the trees. That good sat with me for days. Because she didn't say good, that was the right call for safety reasons, or good, the terrain is rough at night. She just said good, with exactly the tone of someone who had expected me to say yes, who needed to hear yes, and who did not want to say anything else about it. The second thing happened 10 days later. I was doing my noon scan of the horizon, which I always did with binoculars from the cab. Clear day, good visibility. and I swept the binoculars around to the North Hollow, which I did every hour because the terrain there gathered haze before any other area, and it was good to monitor. In the hollow, at the edge of the tree line, there was a figure. I thought it was a person at first. It was standing upright and the proportions were human. But the way it was standing was wrong. It was facing away from me, but the head was turned too far. Not enough to be facing me entirely, but past the shoulder in a way that I felt rather than measured. A small wrongness in the angle. I watched it through the binoculars for maybe 30 seconds before I realized I was not breathing. Then it was not there. No movement. No transition into absence. Just present, then not. I logged it. I radioed it. The office said it was likely a hiker who had disoriented themselves in the hollow and wandered. They said they'd check the trail registers for anyone overdue. Nobody was overdue. Daryl Oates was my supply driver. He came up the access road every 2 weeks with my food order in the bed of his truck. A man somewhere between 55 and 70 with a thick gray mustache and boots so worn they looked like they'd been on his feet since before I was born. He knew every twist in that road by feel and took them at a speed that always made me grab the door handle when I rode down with him. He had done the supply run for this station for 11 years. I know that because he told me the first time he came up in June, not as a boast but as information. He said it the way you'd tell someone you'd worked a shift at the same diner for 11 years matter-of-factly, without needing it to mean anything. I liked Daryl immediately. He was funny in a dry and unhurried way, and he had opinions about weather that were consistently more accurate than the satellite data I was logging, and he never once tried to convince me the mountain was anything other than what it was. He never used the word mysterious. He never told ghost stories. He just delivered my groceries and drank the instant coffee I made him and told me about his grandkids and left. In July, on his third visit, I told him about the voice and the figure. He listened without interrupting. He set down his coffee mug. He looked at the table. Then he said, "You follow the rules?" I said yes. He said, "All of them?" I said yes. I was pretty sure this was true. He nodded slowly and then he said, "There've been rough patches up here. Not just this season." He picked up his coffee. "Long as you follow the rules, you come out the other side." I said, "What happened? In the rough patches?" He said, "Different things, depending on the person." I said, "Daryl, can you be more specific?" He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not quite pity, not quite warning, something in between. Then he said, "I'll tell you something I know for a fact. There's been someone at this post every fire season since 1933. 90 years. Some of them had a rough stretch. Some of them had a terrible stretch. None of them that followed the rules all the way through failed to come back down in September." He didn't look at me when he said the last part. He looked out the window at the tree line. I noticed that day that Daryl always stopped his truck at the base of the platform stairs. He never came up to the tower itself. Not once in 11 years, I realized. He always had me come down to him. I didn't ask him about that. I should have. I was afraid he'd answer. The last time I saw Daryl Oates was on the 5th of August. He came up with my order, same as always. He seemed fine. He was in a good mood, actually. His granddaughter had just started high school and had apparently, on her second day, told a teacher something that Daryl found deeply satisfying and wouldn't stop smiling about. He laughed 3 times, which was a lot for Daryl. He drank his coffee. He carried the boxes up to the cabin door for me, which was the furthest he ever came to the tower, and handed them across the threshold. He said, at the door, just before he left, "You're past the halfway point. Stretch run. Just keep doing what you're doing." I said I would. He gave me a small nod, like we'd concluded some important agreement, and he walked back down the stairs and got in his truck and drove down the road. When the next supply day came, A man I had never seen before drove up in a different truck. He told me his name was Pete and that he was covering Daryl's route for a while. I asked what had happened to Daryl. Pete said he didn't know the details. He said Daryl had just stopped showing up. I asked if he was sick. Pete said he didn't know. He said Daryl had gone up on a hike the weekend after he'd been here and hadn't come back, and they were still looking. They never found him. I know that because I checked after. I checked for months after. Daryl Oates, 62 years old, experienced hiker, familiar with every trail on the mountain, gone. No trace, no sign of struggle, no explanation. His granddaughter had just started high school. I found it a week after Daryl disappeared. I had known something was behind the wood stove since I arrived. There was a gap between the stove and the wall that I'd looked into with a flashlight on my first day and written off as empty. It wasn't empty. I just hadn't looked far enough back. A wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in an oilcloth that had been sealed with what looked like electrical tape layered many times over. Inside the box was a notebook. Not one notebook. A collection of papers and sections that had been bound together over many decades. Pages from different eras with different handwriting. Some typed, some photocopied, some torn from larger documents. On the inside cover, someone had written, "For whoever comes next." I sat on the floor of the cabin and read the whole thing in one sitting. Took me 4 hours. It was a record left by the people who had staffed this tower before me. Not all of them, not 90 years worth, but 17 of them. 17 voices, some writing directly in the book, some leaving letters or loose pages that had been tucked in. The earliest entry I found was from 1961. The most recent was from 3 years ago. What they described was consistent, not identical. Each person experienced it slightly differently, but the shape of it was the same. The slow wrongness in the early weeks. The voices from below the tree line at night, the figures at the edge of the hollow, the fog moving wrong, the door unlocking, and then the escalation, things becoming more specific, more personal, more intimate in ways that shouldn't be possible for something that didn't know them. The rules were in there too, handwritten in different versions, refined over decades, each person adding to them based on what they had learned. The 7 rules on my laminated card weren't bureaucratic boilerplate. They were 60 years of accumulated survival knowledge, written and rewritten by people who had lived in this tower and made mistakes and found a way to September. I understood, reading this, that the rules had been earned in the worst possible way, by the people who had not followed them. There were 3 names in the ledger of people who had not made it to September. Not dead, I don't think. Just gone. Left in the middle of a night, apparently, without their things. One of them had left mid-sentence in his final entry, the pen still making a trailing mark off the page. The second thing the ledger told me, the thing in the hollow was not recent. It was not an anomaly. It had been there for as long as anyone had been watching, and possibly much longer, and it had learned, over decades, how to know the people who came to the tower. How to find what they carried with them, how to use it. And the third thing was at the back of the book, in handwriting that I recognized before I understood why I recognized it. A short paragraph, maybe 7 lines, in my own handwriting. My particular F's and H's, my habit of cramping my letters at the end of lines, my signature at the bottom. It described something I had not yet experienced. It was dated 3 weeks from the day I was reading it. I sat on the floor of that cabin for a long time after that. I need to be careful here about what I say. I want to tell you that I radioed in about the ledger and that someone came and took it seriously and that there were protocols. There were no protocols. I radioed in. The office asked if I was okay. I said I'd found some old materials from previous occupants and wanted to know if there was a process for logging them. They told me to add it to the property inventory list and put it back where I'd found it. That was Rule 7 anyway. Put it back. So I did. What the ledger told me in pieces from 17 different people across 60 years was this. The thing in the hollow, they called it different things, and I'll just say the thing because none of the names fit and all of them feel wrong. The thing did not want to harm the person in the tower. That was stated clearly by multiple contributors. The people who went missing because they went toward it, not because it came for them. It drew you. It learned you and it drew you. And what it wanted. And this was stated most clearly by a woman named Paulette who had staffed the tower in the late 1990s and who wrote the clearest and most analytical entries in the whole ledger. What it wanted was continuation. That was her word. Continuation. It wanted to be known, and it wanted the person who knew it to remain, to become part of the thing that knew it. She described it as absorption, but not violent absorption. She said it was the way a river absorbs rain. The rain doesn't stop existing. It just doesn't have an outside anymore. Paulette had made it to September. She'd left a forwarding address in her entry, in case any future occupant wanted to talk. I tried it when I got home. The address was a house in Spruce Pine. The person who lived there now had no idea who she was. The ledger also told me the following specific piece of information, which I read 3 times. The thing became personal. That was the mechanism. It started with general disturbance and moved toward total intimacy. And the specific material it used, the private information it drew on, was always things the person had not resolved. Grief they hadn't processed. Decisions they hadn't forgiven themselves for. The open wounds. I thought about my girlfriend's 2 boxes in my closet that I hadn't opened. I thought about the night 3 weeks before she left, when she'd been crying and I had not gotten up. I had heard her crying in the kitchen at 2 a.m. and I had decided, in the way that people decide things they don't fully acknowledge deciding, that I was too tired, that it could wait until morning. I lay in the dark and listened to her try to be quiet, and I did not get up. She was gone 6 weeks later. I had never told anyone about that night. I had barely told myself. I thought about that a lot, sitting on the floor of that cabin. I put the ledger back behind the stove. The following 3 weeks were structured by the thing's escalation, and by me reading that escalation clearly in the ledger and still, in some ways, being unable to fully prepare for it. The first week after I found the ledger, the disturbances got specific. Not yet personal, just specific. The voice from the hollow called for a man named Thomas 3 nights running. There was no Thomas connected to me that I could identify. I found out later, checking the ledger dates, that a man named Thomas Birch had staffed the tower in 1978 and had left mid-August without his things. The second week, the voice began using my name. I want to tell you that I handled this well. I want to tell you that because I'd read the ledger I was prepared and clinical about it. I was not. When I heard my name, my actual name, spoken by something that sounded like it was standing 10 feet below the platform in complete darkness, I stopped breathing. My hands went cold. The animal part of my brain, the part that is very, very old, went into a state that I don't have a better word for than collapse. I followed Rule 2. I stayed up top. I did not answer. I logged it and radioed it in. But I want to be honest. Staying silent was the single hardest thing I've done in my life. Not because I was curious, not because I was brave, but because my name is the shortest bridge between yourself and the world. And when something in the dark says it, every piece of you wants to say, yes, I'm here, I'm here. The third week, things got quieter. Not the good kind of quiet, the held breath kind. And then, on the 22nd day after I found the ledger, which was the date I had written at the top of the entry in my own handwriting, it spoke to me in her voice. My girlfriend's voice. My ex-girlfriend. Her exact voice, with her specific pronunciation, the way she slightly swallowed the last syllable of my name when she was tired or sad. Not saying anything threatening. Saying my name and then saying, I'm not angry. I just want you to come down. I was in the cab. I was gripping the edge of the console. The night outside was clear and the stars over the ridge were very bright, and below the platform the darkness was complete. The ledger entry I had written, in handwriting I did not remember making, had said, "Do not mistake understanding for invitation." I said nothing. I stayed where I was. I counted 60 seconds. The voice said, more quietly, "I know you heard me that night. I know you chose not to come." 60 more seconds. "I'm not angry," it said. "I understand why you didn't. And then, worst of all, you were scared. You've always been scared when it matters most. That's not a failure. That's just who you are. I've always known that. I don't have the words for what that felt like. Being known. Not accused, known. Not condemned, understood. Something that should not know me had reached into the exact center of the worst thing I'd done and held it up and said, "Yes, this is you, and it's all right, and you can stop carrying it, just come down." That was the most dangerous moment of my entire time on that mountain. Not the voices, not the figure, not the unlocking door. That gentle, accurate, complete understanding of my worst night. That is what I need you to understand about what was down there. It did not want to hurt me. It wanted me to feel known. And feeling known by something that should not know you is the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Because you understand in that moment what it would cost to say yes. I did not say yes. I counted backward from 200. Twice. The voice did not come again that night. 2 days before that entry's date, I had tried to leave. I want to be clear, I made a genuine attempt. I packed both duffel bags. I loaded them in the supply truck. Pete had let me borrow it for my day off that week, and it was sitting at the base of the stairs. I drove down the access road. The access road is 9 miles to the state route. I know every turn of it by now. I drove it in the dark, no headlights for the first mile because I was afraid. Somehow that light would feel like announcement. Then I turned them on and drove faster. I got to the junction of the access road and the state route. I can see it in my memory exactly, the metal gate across the forestry road, the yellow line on the blacktop, the dark shapes of trees on both sides, and I stopped the truck. There was nothing physically blocking me. The gate was open. The state route was clear. My bags were in the truck. I had my wallet, my phone, my car keys back in Asheville. I sat there for 20 minutes with the engine running. And then I drove back up the mountain. I don't know how to explain this. I have tried to explain it to my therapist and I keep failing. It wasn't paralysis, exactly. It wasn't fear of the road. It felt more like I had understood something sitting at that junction that made leaving feel like the wrong action in a way that had nothing to do with locks or fences or practical barriers. Like leaving would have been a choice that could not be unmade. Not because of the thing in the hollow, but because of myself. Because of what I'd left unfinished, and what leaving would have confirmed about who I was. I drove back up. I put my bags back in the cabin. I made coffee. I did not try to leave again. Not because I couldn't. Because I understood, finally, that my reason for being there had very little to do with the Forestry Service. I made it to September. I am aware that this sounds simple. It was not simple. The last 3 weeks were the hardest because the thing in the hollow had found everything and was using all of it, quietly, on different nights, always gentle, always accurate, never threatening. It understood me in a way that I was still learning to understand myself. But I had the ledger, and the ledger had been written by 17 people who had sat where I was sitting and felt what I was feeling, and each of them had found a way to stay in their own skin until September. And Daryl, I think, had sat in that truck at the base of my stairs for 11 years for a reason he never explained. And his unexplained reason had been its own kind of warning, its own kind of rule. The morning of September 1st, the forestry office called on the radio at 6 a.m. to confirm my checkout date. I said September 5th as contracted. There was a pause, and then the woman on the line, not Karen, a different woman, said, "Good. Good, we'll have someone up to meet you." I left on September 5th with my 2 bags and the equipment log and nothing else. I put the ledger back exactly where I found it because Rule 7 is Rule 7, and because the next person would need it, and because I understood by then that those rules were not restrictions. They were gifts from people who had learned the cost of their absence. I drove down the access road and through the gate and out onto the state route and kept driving and did not stop until I hit the lights of Burnsville. I cried for about 45 minutes in a Hardee's parking lot. Then I went inside and ordered 2 cheeseburgers and ate them both and drove home to Asheville. I need to tell you about Marcus because Marcus is the part of this that I am not at peace with. Marcus is my cousin's son. He's 24. He graduated with a degree in environmental science 2 years ago and has been working in outdoor education since. He heard about the fire lookout position through me, through a conversation we had at Thanksgiving, when I was back home and people were asking what I'd done over the summer and I was still not ready to talk about it properly. I told Marcus it was a fire observation post, remote station work, good pay. I told him the isolation was manageable. I told him it was a good experience for someone interested in forest management. I did not tell him about the ledger. I am not going to tell you what I told myself about why I didn't tell him. I think you can work that out on your own. Marcus applied in February. He was hired by mid-March. He's up there right now as I record this. He's been there since the 1st of May. I have his number. I have called it 3 times. It goes to voicemail, which is normal. There's no cell service up there. I have left messages. Normal messages, the kind you leave when you're just checking in on someone. I have not driven up there. I have not asked Karen Solis to relay a message. I have not told him about the rules or the ledger or what the voices do in the 3rd and 4th weeks. I am telling you all of this because there is a piece of the ledger I did not describe earlier, and I need to describe it now. At the very back, after the last entry, after the entry in my own handwriting dated 3 weeks ahead of when I read it, there were 2 more pages that I read and then chose not to think about. They contained an entry I did not write. The handwriting was not mine. It was neater than mine, smaller letters, careful spacing. The entry described a summer on the mountain. It described the voices and the fog and the figure at the edge of the hollow. It described finding the ledger and reading it. It described following the rules until the end. It was dated May through September of this year. It was signed with Marcus's name. A note to whoever is listening to this. Not the narrator. Not any character in this story. You. I don't know how you found this recording. I don't know what brought you to it at the hour you're listening, in the place you're sitting or lying, in whatever state you were in when you pressed play. But you're here now, and you've heard all of it, and I need to tell you something. The hollows on Roan Mountain are not the only ones. They are the only ones that have been documented, that have had a record kept, that have had rules written and refined and laminated and handed down. But the mechanism, the slow learning, the intimacy, the thing that starts as wrongness and becomes complete understanding, that mechanism is not unique to that mountain. The person in your life who knows you better than you know yourself. The voice you hear at 2 in the morning that sounds like it understands exactly why you made the choice you made in the night you don't tell anyone about. The pull you feel sometimes toward things you cannot name, in a direction that feels like relief. You know what I'm describing. You may have already heard it. The rules, if you find yourself in need of them, don't go toward it at night. Don't answer when it says your name. Don't mistake understanding for invitation. Whatever you find that was left for you, leave it for the person who comes next. And whatever you do, whatever else you do, read the full record before September. We've been saving it for you. Welcome. We've been expecting you for quite some time.